We talk about emotions all the time, but have you ever thought about how much they really drive everything? Our choices, relationships? I mean, history is shaped by how people were feeling. And you've given us some excerpts from Michael Posick's book, Jesus and the Emotions, Guts, Fear, and Joy, to look at how the Bible, specifically the Gospels, handle emotions.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how ancient people, especially in a context we might not expect like the Bible, viewed emotions. And it's not just theology, it's about tapping into something fundamental about humans.
Yeah.
I think it still connects with us today.
Yeah, totally. I think we tend to picture biblical figures as almost these larger-than-life, emotionless beings. But this book just throws that out the window. It goes straight into the, the nitty-gritty. It focuses on the physicality of emotions, like how the gut was considered the seat of strong feelings.
Right. The book talks about this Greek word splagnon, which means innards, like your stomach, intestines, all that. And for ancient Greeks and Hebrews, this wasn't just some physical location. It's where strong emotions were believed to come from.
That's so interesting because even today we talk about gut feelings or having butterflies in our stomach. It's like this ancient connection between our bodies and our emotions. It's still there in how we talk.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating is that modern science is starting to understand this ancient wisdom. There's more and more research on the gut-brain connection, showing how the bacteria in our gut can actually affect our mood, our stress, and even how we think. So our ancestors might have been onto something with this whole gut feeling thing.
Okay, so let's look at an example from the book. It talks about the story of Jesus healing the leper and compares the different versions in the Gospels.
Right. If you look at Mark, it describes Jesus feeling indignant when he saw the leper. But Posick says, a better translation might be that Jesus' stomach turned, like he had this visceral reaction to the leper's suffering.
So it's not just an intellectual response. It's like Jesus is physically feeling the leper's pain in his gut. That's intense.
Yeah. And the book highlights how this description in Mark is so much more raw, visceral, than how Matthew and Luke tell it, where they use more sanitized language and tone down Jesus's emotional response.
Why do you think they did that? Were they uncomfortable showing Jesus being so emotional?
Well, that's a question scholars have debated for centuries. Some think Matthew and Luke might have changed the story on purpose to show a more controlled, stoic Jesus, maybe to reach a wider audience, or to fit certain theological ideas.
It makes you think about what got lost over time.
Yeah.
Like how much of that raw emotion was edited out.
It really shows how these texts have been interpreted and reinterpreted over the centuries, which is why understanding the original context is so important.
Okay, so speaking of interpretations, the book discusses this idea that Christianity's focus on compassion was revolutionary in the ancient world.
Right. It seems obvious to us now. But back then, compassion, or eleos in Greek, wasn't always valued. In fact, a lot of philosophies, like Stoicism, thought emotions, got in the way of reason and virtue. They encouraged detachment and control over your emotions as the way to be truly happy.
So then Christianity comes along and says, nope, compassion is essential. It's at the core of who we are and how we relate to God and to each other. That's a pretty big statement.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the book explored how this emphasis on compassion wasn't just theoretical. It came from Hebrew tradition, drawing on terms like cheesed, which includes ideas of loving kindness, loyalty, and real commitment to others.
So it's not just about feeling sorry for someone. It's about actively helping them, showing kindness and mercy, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is this idea of compassion was often linked to splagnon, that gut-level empathy we were talking about. It wasn't just mental. It was a deep physical response to the suffering of others.
Okay, let's talk about a story that really shows the splagnon idea, the parable of the Good Samaritan. We all know the story, but the book highlights something I'd never noticed before.
Yeah. The story specifically says that the Samaritan was moved in his splagnon when he saw the injured man. It wasn't just duty or obligation. He was physically and emotionally moved.
Not just any injured man, right? It's someone who would have been seen as an outsider, even an enemy.
Absolutely. And that's where this revolutionary idea of Christian compassion comes in. It challenges us to go beyond our tribal instincts, to show kindness and mercy to those who are different, to those we might even see as enemies.
Well, it reminds me of another story Posick brings up, the book of Jonah. Jonah is furious with God for showing compassion to the people of Nineveh, who are enemies of Israel. It's like Jonah can't stand that God is willing to show mercy to people outside his own group.
It's a powerful story that challenges us to look at our own biases and ask what compassion really means. It asks us to face our own discomfort with showing grace to those who are different, those we might not naturally want to help.
So how do you think these ancient stories about compassion speak to us today in a world that feels more and more divided?
That's a great question. These stories offer a strong alternative to the us versus them thinking we see so much today. They invite us to consider a bigger, more inclusive understanding of compassion, one that goes beyond political, social, and even religious boundaries.
It's like they're saying that true compassion isn't just about feeling sorry for those like us. It's about extending empathy and care to everyone, even those we disagree with or don't understand.
And that's challenging, but ultimately incredibly hopeful, especially now. It suggests compassion can be a powerful force to bridge divides and create a more just and equitable world.
It's interesting you mentioned Stoicism before. They thought detachment was a good thing. But this book points out that even in the Bible, sometimes not reacting emotionally is a problem. Like with the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man just ignores Lazarus' suffering right there in front of him.
Yeah, that's a great point. It challenges this idea that the Bible just wants us to suppress all emotion. It's more nuanced than that. It's about using emotions to do good. Like compassion should push us to help, not just sit back and have fancy philosophical thoughts.
It really shows that actions are more important than words. But you know, one emotion that's hard to ignore, and definitely not seen as a virtue in the Bible, is fear. The Gospels have all these intense scenes where fear is front and center.
Yeah, fear is such a basic human emotion, and the Bible doesn't shy away from showing its power and how it can affect us. To understand how fear was seen back then, it helps to look at the Greek word phobos. It's often meant not just fear of something specific, but also like a sense of dread or awe when you're facing the unknown.
Or the supernatural.
Or the divine.
So it's not just being scared of a snake. It's a deeper fear of things outside our control, things we can't fully understand.
Exactly. And that's really important when we look at how the disciples reacted to Jesus, especially when his divinity was really clear, like in the story of Jesus calming the storm.
Oh man, that scene where the disciples are freaking out, thinking they're going to drown, and Jesus is just sleeping through it all. It's such a contrast.
Yeah. And when Jesus wakes up, he basically says, "Why are you so scared? Where's your faith?" The book connects this to the idea that pistis, the Greek word for trust or faith, is often presented as the opposite of fear in the Gospels.
So the more you trust in Jesus, in his power and connection to God, the less fear you feel. It's almost like trust protects you from the unknown, from those things that can make us feel overwhelmed with fear.
That's a great observation, and it makes you think about how we deal with fear ourselves. What are the things we hold on to for security and comfort when things are uncertain?
I feel like that theme of trust versus fear comes up in a lot of gospel stories. It's like the disciples are always being tested, pushed to the limits of their faith.
Like when Jesus walks on water, they've already seen him calm the storm. They know what he can do. But when they see him coming towards them on the water, they're terrified. It's like even though they know it's Jesus, they still can't quite grasp it.
It's almost like they're saying, okay, we get you can calm storms, but walking on water, that's just too much.
Right. And what's interesting is this fear isn't shown as a lack of faith. It's more about the limits of human understanding. Even the disciples who were closest to Jesus struggled to understand what they were seeing.
So it's not about never being afraid or doubting. It's about dealing with those feelings and choosing to trust, even when things seem impossible.
Exactly. And that tension between faith and fear, between what we know and what we don't, really resonates with us even today. We live in a world that's constantly changing, full of uncertainty and challenges.
Yeah, but instead of just jumping into those uncertain situations, those things that might make us afraid, maybe we need to stop and ask ourselves, what do we trust in? What are the things that help us get through the storms in our own lives?
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about recognizing that fear is natural, but it doesn't have to control us. We can choose to trust, choose hope, even when things are tough.
So we've talked about compassion and fear, both pretty intense emotions, but what about the more positive side, like joy, which in the Bible is about way more than just having fun?
Yeah, the Greek word for joy, chara, it's much deeper than just being happy. It's often connected to this feeling of peace and purpose. That comes from trusting in God's plan, even when you're going through hard times.
So it's not about pretending the bad stuff isn't there. It's about finding a deeper kind of joy that goes beyond what's happening right now. It's like that quote, joy is not the absence of suffering. It's the presence of God.
I love that. And the book uses a couple of different stories to show this. One is the parable of the prodigal son, which at first seems like a simple story.
Yeah.
About forgiveness and making up.
Right. The son messes up. wastes all his money, comes crawling back home, expecting to be disowned, but the father's just so happy to have him back.
But if we look closer, we see the father's joy isn't just about having his son physically back. It's about this deep, unconditional love he has, no matter what his son did. And the book connects this back to that visceral response, that gut-level feeling we talked about. It's not just in his head. It's a physical experience of deep, overwhelming joy and love.
So it's like the father's splachnon is overflowing with joy and compassion for his son.
Exactly. And that kind of joy spreads, right? It can heal, bring people back together, bring hope when things seem really dark.
It reminds us that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a chance for redemption, forgiveness, joy.
Absolutely. And then the book talks about the Christmas story, which is obviously full of joy and celebration.
Yeah. We think of Christmas as presents and carols and all that. But the book says there's a deeper meaning there.
Right. Luke really focuses on joy as a main theme of Christmas. And he specifically highlights how this joy is felt by everyday people, like the shepherds who first heard about Jesus' birth.
That's a really nice point. It's like this divine event, the birth of Jesus, brings joy to everyone, no matter who they are or what they believe.
Yeah. And it makes you think about what that Christmas feeling really is. Is it just the holiday stuff? Or is there something more, something universal that connects to this ancient idea of joy as being essential to being human?
You know, we've been talking about compassion and joy as these positive emotions, but the book also looks at emotions that can be negative, like zelos, the Greek word for zeal.
Zeal is really interesting because it can be so powerful, but also easily misdirected. In ancient times, zealous was often about sticking to rules and boundaries, and sometimes it was connected to violence and aggression.
It's like a fire. That can either keep you warm or burn your house down, depending on how you control it. We see this in a lot of Bible stories, right? Like the Pharisees. They were known for their zeal in following religious law, sometimes to the point of being judgmental and harsh.
Right. And the book even mentions Paul, who before he became a Christian, described himself as persecuting Christians.
Yeah.
Because of his zelos for his own beliefs.
So it's not just about having strong beliefs, it's about how you use them, how they turn into actions. Zeal without compassion, without understanding, can become really destructive.
Absolutely. And the book uses a great example to show this. Jesus cleansing the temple. Yeah. Where he flips the tables over and drives the money changers out. Yeah. Some people see this as righteous anger, zeal for God's house being disrespected.
Right, like he's so outraged by what's happening that he can't hold back.
Yeah. But the book also points out that some scholars see it differently. They say Jesus wasn't necessarily angry, but driven by a deeper desire to shake things up, to challenge the religious leaders, to purify the temple, not just physically, but spiritually.
So even in this seemingly simple example of zelos, there are different ways to interpret it. It makes you think if real zeal, the kind that aligns with God's will, is less about showing anger and more about an inner commitment to justice and righteousness.
That's a really good point. And it challenges us to look at our own motivations, to ask ourselves what drives us and how that's affecting the world around us.
Are we using our zeal to bring people together or to divide them further? Are we motivated by love or fear? Those are questions I think we all need to consider.
For sure. And the Bible gives us a powerful framework for figuring out these complicated emotions. It doesn't avoid the messy, contradictory parts of being human. It encourages us to embrace all our emotions, from fear and despair to joy and compassion, and to find meaning and purpose in it all.
You know, it's interesting how many of these stories are about trust. Like we were talking about the disciples being afraid during the storm, but Jesus basically tells them to have faith in him.
Yeah, trust. Or pistis in Greek. It's a big theme throughout the Gospels.
Yeah.
And the book makes this point that this idea of trust was pretty radical back then. Like, trusting the gods was often met with skepticism, even ridicule. They were seen as unpredictable, even kind of random.
So saying just trust God wouldn't have been this simple, comforting message. It would challenge how people thought.
Exactly. And that makes Jesus' focus on trust even more important. He's always asking his disciples to have faith, to believe in what he says and does, even when it doesn't make sense, or when they're facing these huge challenges.
Like with calming the storm, it's not just about Jesus showing he has power over nature. It's about him saying to the disciples, why are you so afraid? Don't you trust me?
Right. It's a reminder that real faith isn't just about believing things intellectually. It's about this deep, strong trust that helps you face the unknown without being totally freaked out by fear. And this idea of trust is like an antidote to fear. That comes up a lot in the Gospels.
It's like that saying, fear knocks, but faith answers.
Yeah. And it's not about pretending we never feel fear or doubt. We're human. We're going to have those moments. Even the disciples who were with Jesus all the time.
Struggled with it.
Yeah, they saw the miracles, heard the teachings, but they still doubted, questioned things, got scared. And that's actually kind of comforting. Like, it's okay to not have everything figured out, to struggle with our doubts and fears.
Definitely. The book doesn't present faith as something that's just there, unchanging. Yeah. It recognizes that being human is complex, that we're always going to be wrestling with questions, doubts, uncertainties. But it suggests that even when we're uncertain, we can choose to move towards trust, towards hope, towards something bigger than ourselves.
This whole conversation makes me think about how often we make faith just a mental thing. Like, if you believe these doctrines, you're good. But this book shows it's so much deeper than that. It's not just what we think. It's how we feel, how we live, how we relate to the world. It's about that deep trust, that splaganon connection to something bigger. That's a beautiful way to put it. And the book actually talks a lot about the heart as the center of our emotional and spiritual lives. And when the Bible talks about the heart, it's not just feelings, it's our thoughts, motivations, deepest beliefs, our will. Is who we are at our core.
So real faith, pistis. It's not just saying, I believe in God. It's about having that trust in everything about you, your mind, your body, your whole being.
Exactly. And letting that trust shape how you live, how you treat people, how you handle challenges, how you find joy and meaning. It's a way of life, not just a set of beliefs.
Wow, this deep dive has been amazing. We've talked about so much compassion, fear, joy, zeal, trust, and we've only just scratched the surface of all the emotions the Bible explores.
It really is amazing how these ancient texts can still be so relevant and meaningful today. Like, we're connecting to something timeless, something essential about being human.
I think what I'm taking away from this is we need to start trying to separate our emotions from logic or spirituality. Maybe we should start listening to those gut feelings, pay attention to those physical reactions, and recognize that our emotions are a part of who we are, how we connect with each other, and how we experience something bigger than ourselves.
That's a really powerful message. It's like an invitation to embrace all of who we are, to find meaning and purpose in all our emotions, even the messy and complicated ones.
This deep dive has definitely given us a lot to think about. I hope it's given you some new insights and questions, too. Thanks for joining us on this emotional roller coaster through the Bible. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.